We're good? We're echoing. Okay, I'm going to... We okay? Okay. All right, much better. All right, I'd like to call the town council meeting, special meeting of January 30th to order. Clerk, could you please take the attendance?
Councilmember Rennie?
Here.
Councilmember Moore?
Here.
Councilmember Hudes?
Here.
Vice Mayor Badami?
Here.
Mayor Risto?
Here. Thank you. Now we'll roll our video of meeting behavior and decorum.
The public is welcome to participate at town council meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meetings is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. At each meeting, the following expectations of civil conduct shall apply. 1. For the benefit of the entire community, the town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the council agenda. 2. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at council meetings. 3. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at town council meetings. 4. All public comments at the town council meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. 5. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the mayor may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the council exiting the chamber. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the council would return to the chamber and the mayor would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a council meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code Section 403. These expectations of conduct also apply to meetings of all town boards, committees, and commissions.
Thank you. On tonight's agenda, we only have one item. It's a special meeting, so we will not be having a general verbal communications. We'll only be speaking on this item. So first of all, I want to acknowledge everybody who's written into the town council. We've received a number of comments, and I guess we'll start out on the item and then go to public comment on this item. But if you'd like to speak about the housing element adoption, please get a card into the clerk. Thank you. And now we'll go with Ms. Walters.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and council members. The town of Los Gatos is required to adopt an updated housing element for the period covering 2023 to 2031 by January 31st of this year. Actually, could we put the slide up for the PowerPoint presentation? Or I can pass. Thank you. Next slide. On December 20th, 2022, the Town Council recommended that the current version of the draft housing element as submitted by HCD on October 14th, 2022 be considered for adoption prior to the statutory deadline of January 31st, 2023. and that the site's inventory utilize the minimum density. On January 11th of this year, the Planning Commission recommended that the Town Council adopt the draft housing element with a revised site's inventory analysis and inventory form. On January 12th, the following day, the town received HCD's findings and comment letter on the draft housing element after their 90-day review. Next slide. Next, oh, there we go, thank you. In the staff report, it highlights the required components of a housing element under state law, and this includes the following topics: housing needs assessment, evaluation of past performance, community engagement, constraints analysis, policies and programs, affirmatively further fair housing, and site inventory. Next slide. The purpose of the agenda tonight is for Town Council to consider the adoption of the resolution contained in Attachment 16, adopting the 2023 to 2031 housing element if the Town Council finds it to be in substantial compliance with state law. There's a desk item that was circulated this evening containing additional public comments, as well as responses to council members' questions. Attachment 14 includes a revised Appendix D in the site's inventory analysis showing track changes. Attachment 15 includes a revised Appendix H, which also includes track changes for that item. This concludes staff's presentation, and the community development staff is available for questions.
Thank you. Do members of Vice Mayor Badami?
I don't believe I got the desk item with council members' questions. Was that distributed today? By email. By email at what time? 2:55. What time? 2:55. Okay, thank you.
No, it was a little bit later than that. I thought we were going to have some copies available.
Yes, there was an issue printing because they were so large, so they're still in the process of printing. There was a couple that are available.
I'd like to see that, because if there's council member questions on there, I'd like to have all the same material that my fellow council members have.
Okay, yeah, I'm just seeing this for the first time, too. I didn't realize there was another item. Okay.
Let me
Vice
just,
Mayor Badami.
thank you. Councilmember Moore was generous enough to give me a stack that included it, so thank you very much. I'll do a quick read, but everybody notice how thick it is.
If you would like,
Manager.
if you'd like, we can summarize the responses to the council questions that's in the written desk item report, and then the summary of the attachments was already provided. But I think that might help. That way everyone and the public as well can hear what those questions were.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So this was a desk item that was circulated this late afternoon. In response to a request from a council member, attachments 15 and 14 show track changes as described in staff's presentation. So those do show those track changes for Appendix D and Appendix H. The staff did condense the version of the site's inventory form for more legible viewing, because as you know, that attachment is very small and hard to read. So we hope that that assists council. The changes that were made, these changes were that were made to the version that was submitted to HCD on October 14th in response to direction from council on December 20th. This included the changes that show minimum density for the site's inventory. And again, these changes are a part of the housing element, which is included Exhibit 1 in the draft ordinance. In a response to council members' questions about the difference between total number of sites included in the October draft and the total number of sites included in the current draft, when utilizing minimum density versus typical density, staff's provided a breakdown of that. So using typical density, the site's inventory that was submitted in October 2022 had 46 sites with a total capacity of 2,371 units. This included a 19% buffer. And then the revised inventory, which utilized the minimum density, has an addition of 2 sites. So that totals 48 sites. And that has a total capacity of 22,312 units. And that would be a 16% buffer. Also brought to staff's attention, there were 2 rows that were not included in Appendix H, and those were corrected in an Attachment 15, as well as Exhibit 1 to Attachment 16. And then the town attorney has provided a revised draft resolution in Attachment 16, and then Attachment 17 does include 2 sets of public comments. Thank you.
Okay, that was a lot at once. I'm still thinking. Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. With regard to the draft resolution, I wonder if the town attorney could summarize the changes to the resolution, please?
Yes. Based on some of the public comment that the town received, it appeared that there were questions as to why town staff felt that the housing element was in substantial compliance with state law. And so the resolution has been edited to set forth the reasoning. And, you know, to summarize, the reasoning is that the town revised its site inventory as recommended by HCD to assume that properties will be developed at their minimum allowable density. And then as a result of that change, the town added 2 additional sites to the town's site inventory to address that comment from HCD. And so the edits to the resolution are intended to make that thought process clearer.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions for staff right now before we go to public comment? No? Okay, well then I'll call up the public. You each have 3 minutes to speak, and let me see, I'm looking on Zoom. I see one hand raised on Zoom. I've got 2 cards here. I'll start with the people that were here because I had the cards first. You have 3 minutes, and when your time is up, I'll allow you to finish your sentence, and that's it unless there's questions. So, Lee Fago.
Good evening, and thank you for this meeting this evening. I'm speaking only as a long-term Los Gatos resident and not representing any group. And now, quoting from the town's own website, without a certified housing element with substantial compliance, the town is at risk to lose local land use control, including zoning authority and the ability to issue building permits. Builder's remedy could be implemented for those sites. The town is also responsible for accommodating an increased number of housing units, which I've just learned just now you've apparently done. The town is ineligible for various state-administered funds for roads, sewers, parks, housing, and planning if they're not in compliance. And the town is also, if not in compliance, vulnerable to legal challenge of its general plan, which could result in a lawsuit. Consequences of lawsuits include court approval of housing developments on behalf of the community and attorney fees associated with the lawsuit. My comments to this challenge, as the town only received 11 pages of written feedback January the 12th to our October 22nd draft of the housing element, with the required changes, and we do not get a time extension to work on incorporating these changes. We must submit a document that shows how we are in compliance with the submission by tomorrow. That letter stated, quote, revisions will be necessary to comply with state housing element law, end quote. Were changes made to meet this requirement other than the one you've just listed, or is the town going to approve a document that they know is not in compliance and subjects us to losing local control? And if we did make such changes, for transparency, is that available for community review first? Please show that HCD's January 12, 23 letter with the required changes listed, and then how we addressed each of those comments in a format that everyone can follow. With that as a reference, in a red line version of the housing element will be much better communication and demonstrate transparency missing so far. Why did the Planning Commission vote to recommend the council adopt the housing element document after the chair said, and this is just at the last meeting, quote, if not in compliance, it said not to if a letter of non-compliance is received, why submit a document you know is not in compliance? And besides responding to each of the items listed in the HCD letter, new solutions need to be considered, such as other types of housing possible in neighborhoods, such as cottage courts with duplexes and quadplexes around such courts. Revert to low-density residential standards from the earlier plan. Let's put together a workshop or series of workshops on the boulevard, this was discussed recently, with property owners, both residential and commercial, and invited developers. Have you adequately addressed the referendum? That's also a challenge. Focus on the housing element now, and the general plan can be completed later.
You can finish your last sentence.
Okay. So it can be incorporated, and then the housing element as a critical and now compliant element.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for the speaker? Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Lee Quintana.
Good evening, Council. I'd like to state that based on the letter from the state, while the updated inventory and sites analysis is an important part of meeting the comments from the state, it is only one part. Basically, the letter indicates that there's a lot of additional analysis that needs to be done prior to making any updates to the plan itself. And that just, I know staff has talked about modifying the dialogue and upping the dialogue, but the dialogue has to come after the results of a thorough analysis that the state is asking for, and this hasn't been done yet. It was stated several times at the Planning Commission meeting that there were only minor changes that might need to be done, and reading the letter, even though in large part there are parts of it that are pretty formulated, it still indicates that the changes are going to be more than just a few and more than minor. And so I do not see how you can come to the conclusion that the plan that you're approving tonight or considering to approve tonight, the housing element itself, is in substantial compliance with the state. That doesn't happen until the state receives the final draft and comments on it. And by giving it certification, it's saying that you have a compliant element. We don't have that yet. So I'm still very confused by this whole process. It seems, I don't know. I don't even know how to explain it anymore. And the last thing I'd like to say is regarding the general plan referendum. I think that needs to be thoroughly explained within the document itself to the HCD to explain the various possibilities that might happen. We don't know what's going to happen yet, and how each possibility would be handled. Thank you. I suggest you do not approve the HE housing element tonight.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for the speaker?
I would also like to add that, you know, I wasn't even able to find the desk item out in the front, and so it's almost impossible to know what it was by the short summary that was given. Yeah, when it looks like it's hundreds of pages long.
Thank you. We have no more speakers in the room, but we do have two speakers on Zoom right now. Renee Baez, if we can unmute her. Okay, you can speak now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
No worries. No worries. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and council members. I want to first thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. My name is Renee Baez, and I represent the NorCal Carpenters Union. And tonight I want to speak about 3 simple things that will benefit the beautiful town of Los Gatos and also the housing element as a whole. And I believe these 3 things should also be basic labor standards. One, that's the use of apprenticeship programs, meaning every worker is trained to do the work correctly and also safely. Number 2 is healthcare for all workers and their families. And number 3, which is local hire. You see, projects that invest in apprenticeships, prevailing wage, healthcare, and local hire are the best deal for construction workers and the community. This allows the workers and their families to live in the communities that they work in. This also means those wages that are earned will be reinvested back into the local community as they spend their earnings, and their tax dollars will also help fund local schools and government. Now, I understand that California needs housing. California needs affordable housing, but you know what the construction men and women who are building these housing need is a livable wage. They need health care, they need representation, they need honor, and they deserve respect. Now, I didn't see any labor requirements in the housing element, and I want to know what this city is doing to prevent the construction workers from being exploited by developers and the contractors that they hire. You see, some of us are born and raised in this town, and some of us lived here for many years, but we allow developers who come from out of town to forge an identity on us. And then what they do is they hire non-responsible general contractors who in return cheat their workers and cheat the community. And this is something that we continuously allow, not just in this town, but in neighboring cities. And I think when you're thinking about the housing element and projects that are being built, we need to first think about those who are building the projects, because that's where it all starts. They're being cheated. And what happens when you build something cheap? It becomes that. And we're allowing that in our communities. And I think if we adopt those labor standards, the community as a whole will benefit from everything that they do. It starts with that. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for the speaker? No? Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jack Veneta.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor Ristow, Vice Mayor Badami, council members and staff. The Los Gatos Community Alliance has deep concerns regarding the legality and the appropriateness of the actions being proposed by the Planning Commission and town staff for today's meeting with respect to the town's housing element. On January 11th, the Planning Commission forwarded to Council a recommendation to adopt the draft housing element that it had previously submitted to the California HCD on October 14th. The Planning Commission made its recommendation on January 11th with full knowledge that it would receive HCD's written comments no later than the very next day, January 12th. When those comments arrived the next day, they included the finding that the town's submission did not substantially comply with the housing element law, along with multiple detailed reasons why this was the case. This finding triggers certain provisions of California housing element law. Specifically, the town council is now legally required to either A, change the draft housing element to comply with the law before adopting it, or B, set forth a detailed explanation of the reasons it believes the housing element complies with the law, despite HCD's finding to the contrary. Nevertheless, the Planning Commission and town staff are recommending to the town council that it ignore these legally required actions and instead has proposed a resolution to adopt the draft housing element essentially unchanged from when it was submitted to HCD back in October. The resolution being proposed by the town staff contains the completely misleading and untrue assertion that the draft housing element substantially complies with housing element law. How do we know this assertion is untrue? First of all, because the HCD letter says it does not comply with the law. And because the same HCD letter sets forth multiple detailed reasons why this is the case. None of these reasons are rebutted in the draft resolution before you today. Furthermore, the town staff and Planning Commission have already said they plan to continue working on the housing element in response to the HCD letter in order to bring the housing element into compliance with the HCD comments in housing element law. If the housing element is already in compliance, then why is there a need to continue working on it? There are several potential legal consequences for taking this non-legal action. But setting those aside, it is mind-boggling to consider that the town staff and Planning Commission have placed before the town council today a recommendation to take an action that is clearly not legally permissible. We recommend that you reject the flawed recommendation to adopt a legally deficient housing element. It would not only place the town in legal jeopardy, it would subject the town to potentially severe financial sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any questions for this speaker? All right, I don't see any other hands raised on Zoom, and I don't have any more cards. So I'm going to go ahead and close public comment. And I open this up for questions. Councilmember Rennie.
Just start with some basic ones here. I hear some comments that are different than my understanding. So first of all, what staff is suggesting is that we find not that it is in full compliance, but that it's substantially compliant, and that would allow us to adopt it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so if we were to adopt it, that means we still need to make changes to get it fully in compliance, correct?
Yes.
That we have no option but to continue changes after we've adopted.
Yeah, because the town's ultimate goal is to have the housing element certified by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. And so that's our ultimate goal. And to do that, we need to make the revisions suggested by HCD.
And then the other question that seems to be a little confused, if you could clarify, is I've heard, I think twice now, speakers believing that if we adopt it and it's not compliant, we lose local control. My understanding is we lose local control if we don't adopt it and builders' remedies come in. And I think it's actually a little more complicated than that. I think they give us, tell me if I'm wrong, a grace period of 90 days before local control kinds of things start coming in, and it has nothing to do with adopting a version that's not substantially compliant.
So there's two things at play. The first is the statutory scheme, and that's the town's interactions with HCD. And so the statute provides that the town submits a housing element that it believes is substantially compliant with state housing law to HCD. HCD then has up to 90 days to review the second submission. Given that HCD has already reviewed it once, it probably will be shorter than that 90-day period. And then after HCD has completed its review, HCD engages with the town for a minimum of an additional 30 days and meets with the town twice during that 30-day period. And after that 30-day period has expired, HCD then has the ability to refer the town to the Attorney General's office. And so there is a built-in time for the town to continue speaking with HCD. So that's what the statute provides. And then the second part of your question was related to the builder's remedy. And the builder's remedy kicks in if a town does not have an adopted housing element. The statute specifies adopted as opposed to certified. An adopted housing element by January 31st. And the builder's remedy applies when a developer is proposing a development that consists of 20% low income or 100% moderate income units. And if that's the case and the town does not have an adopted housing element, then none of the town's zoning regulations would apply to that application.
And I think maybe implied, but maybe not completely asked, was what are the legal ramifications if we adopt something that now that HCD doesn't agree is substantially compliant?
So then we have that 30-day period in which to make the revisions that HCD feels are necessary. And then if we fail to meet that deadline, it's a true statement that the town would not be eligible for state grants.
And is that
probably the
also
most
the
important one.
case? That's the case if we submit something that, or we adopt something that's not compliant. What if we don't adopt something tonight? Does that come into play also?
I believe there's the HCD, before they rendered us ineligible for grants, I think they would continue the conversation with the town about how to amend the housing element to get it into compliance, because HCD is aware that staff is working on the draft housing element. And what was this other part of your question? One had to do with state grants.
I think that's good enough for now. I'm going to
Okay,
stop for now.
thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Hudes.
Thank you. Based on the desk item and the response, it seems that the town attorney is drawing a distinction between compliant and substantial compliance. I wanted to go over a few things related to that, if I may. In the letter, HCD uses the term a compliant housing element. Is that the same as substantially compliant? I don't see the term substantially in the HCD letter.
My reading of the HCD letter is by compliant, they mean a housing element that's able to be certified in its current state. And so HCD is telling the town that its current draft housing element cannot be certified. But that was prior to the town amending the site inventory. And the site inventory is related to several pages of the HCD comments. And so it does go a long way toward addressing HCD's concerns.
So if I may follow up on that, I'd like to get specific about the items that the attorney and town staff feel support the concept that the current draft is substantially compliant as compared to what we need to work toward to being fully compliant. What items in the draft support us to be able to make the finding that it's substantially compliant?
Thank you. The statute doesn't define the term substantial compliance, but there are some cases that discuss what will constitute substantial compliance. And as a rule, the housing element needs to include an assessment of housing needs and an inventory of resources and constraints relevant to the meeting of those needs. And so the town has prepared the existing housing element does include an assessment of housing needs, and it also includes an inventory of sites that are available to meet that need. It also includes a discussion of constraints on the ability to provide the housing in both the body of the housing element and in Appendix D when each site is discussed individually. And staff recognizes that we need to beef up the discussion of those constraints, but we do feel that it substantially complies with the housing element law.
Just one more follow-up on this level of compliance. When the Planning Commission considered the housing element on January 11th, I believe the staff report advised that the draft was in substantial compliance. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so after receiving the letter on January 12th, do you still advise that the housing element is in substantial compliance? And I want to get at some other words that were used during that meeting. I believe the town attorney stated that it's possible that HCD would recommend some minor changes. Did the HCD letter contain comments more substantial than minor changes? And staff also referred to the absence of fatal flaws, and that phrase seemed to catch on with commissioners. Does the term fatal flaws encompass all the items that are not in substantial compliance, or are there other items that are not in substantial compliance but do not rise to the term fatal flaw?
So for substantial compliance, I would recommend looking at, whether or not the housing element, ultimately it's going to be decided by a court, but I think a court would look at, does the element discuss housing needs? Does it have an inventory of sites available? And does it discuss constraints on the potential development of those sites? So I think that's what a court would look at.
Just one more thing that was in my question was the term minor changes and fatal flaws. Would you like to address that? Because that language was used in the Planning Commission hearing.
Yeah. After reviewing HCD's letter, I probably wouldn't characterize it as minor changes. I would say that HCD, aside from the edits to the sites inventory, is looking for more narrative from the town, more of an explanation of how the town will be monitoring. For example, an explanation of how the town will be monitoring the production of below market units in the future. That's an example of a discussion that needs to be expanded upon in the housing element.
Fatal flaws?
So that term doesn't, come in from the statute or from HCD. I would probably say that a housing element would not be deemed to be substantially compliant if it didn't include those three elements that I mentioned, which were the assessment of the need, the site's inventory, and a discussion of constraints on development.
Thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to get something straight on the timeline. I mean, the town council on December 20th voted unanimously to go forward with this timeline to move and approve the draft housing element, correct? I mean, that was my understanding of what we voted for. And so the reason we've had staff working to get the Planning Commission to approve this and the town council to approve it by this date was with full knowledge that we would not have the comments all addressed and that we know that we're going to have to do further work. And so I guess my question is, and it's going forward with that direction from us and knowing that we had verbal comments from HCD and we knew that we would get the full written comments, midway through the process, it sounds like staff, and if you can reaffirm it, still feels like this is a defensible path, that we can approve a housing element now, knowing full well that we have more work to address. So first of all, can you let me know, do you still stand as strongly behind your agreement that we could go forward with this, with your recommendation tonight to approve?
Yes, the statute has two avenues, as one of the speakers mentioned, when you get comments back from HCD on your housing element. The first option is to make all of the revisions recommended by HCD and adopt that. The second option is to adopt what you submitted originally, along with findings explaining why you think it's in compliance. And staff was able to make one of the changes recommended by HCD, which was a change to the site's inventory. And so we've made that change. Staff has not been able to make the remainder of the edits recommended by HCD, but the resolution contains the findings as to why we think we're substantially compliant, and then it commits to continuing to work with HCD to get the housing element in a state in which it can be ultimately certified by HCD.
Okay, thank you. I guess my question would be, in your mind, has anything changed between when we decided to go forward on this path in December and now, in terms of, I'm trying to understand why there are public coming out that didn't speak against it in December or speak against it at the Planning Commission. So is there any new information that I'm not understanding that is a stumbling block tonight?
Well, I suspect, one thing that's changed is the town has received the comment letter from HCD regarding the housing element. And the letter did have a number of recommended changes. And so the question is, are those recommended changes, substantial enough such that the town should hold off on adopting the housing element? And in staff's view, because we were able to address the concern about the number of available sites, that's bringing the housing element into substantial compliance with housing element law. But I think what has changed between now and December is that the town received HCD's comment letter.
Okay, but we knew that that was going to happen, and there weren't any huge surprises because we'd already had the verbal interchange. Ms. Walters?
Thank you for the question. The comment letter we received was what we anticipated. There wasn't really any big surprises. There were no surprises. We had looked at other jurisdictions. They were similar. There was a lot of new AFFH requirements that all communities received. So as stated earlier and at the last meeting, a lot of it has to do with supporting data, and staff and our consultants are already working on that.
Okay, thank you. Vice Mayor Badami?
I have a few things, so thank you. Ms. Whelan, you mentioned that the comment letter wanted more narrative and explanation from the town. So we have not done that yet. It's not complete with providing our narrative and explanation.
Thank you for the question. Staff's going through the letter with our consultants. Work has begun on many of the comments, as I stated, and I've actually, we met today and some has already been completed, and we'll fold that into the change document. Some comments are just comments that we need to show HCD where those items are in the existing document, so more clarification. So work continues. We have been working on modifying the site inventory and changing the minimum density.
Okay, so thank you for that. And I would just like to reiterate that the December 20th meeting, it was a logical motion for us to move unanimously to adopt a housing element by the deadline date. But we did not know the contents of an HCD letter that we were going to get on January 12th. That being said, you just clarified for me that it's not complete. There's still items that need to be addressed. And we have to certify that this housing element is in complete compliance with Government Code Section 65585, Section F. The third thing I'd like to mention is that I now have 6 inches of a desk item, and I'm happy to share with Ms. Quintana 3 inches of it, which is a repetition. If the town clerk could deliver it to her, that would be great. But I'd also like to mention that both sets, and probably Mayor Risto's as well, is missing attachment 16, which would be the draft resolution that we're to consider tonight. If I could get that attachment, and if we'd be so kind to distribute it, if that's okay, or I'll save it for after the meeting.
Are those your questions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Moore?
Thank you, Mayor. So I don't have a question for staff, but just kind of talking this through. So it seems that on December 20th, we were more worried about the builder's remedy than we were about this kind of alternative of a private suit or a suit from the Attorney General. And we've now received public comments that are saying, you know, perhaps you need to be more worried about the other end of things. And that's, you know, what the town attorney's letter to us today says. And so I think that's really what we just need to be focusing on is are we more concerned about the builder's remedy over here or someone suing the town or, you know, after the 30 days, the attorney general coming after us and suing us. To me, the attorney general suit seems somewhat unlikely, or lower, lower probability because there are, you know, if y'all have been observing some of the other communities. There are other communities that are trying to get much more creative with their housing elements, just doing ADUs and those sorts of things. And their letters were a lot worse than ours, right? They said you need to change pretty much everything, and ours isn't that. And so I don't know how we're all going to feel about builder's remedy versus an individual or an entity coming after us, but I think that's what we need to be kind of thinking about.
Thank you. Perfectly framed. Vice Mayor Badami?
To staff, what are the chances of a builder's remedy coming forth pretty quickly in the town of Los Gatos for affordable housing in our very high cost of land to develop?
I would defer to Director Paulson.
Thank you for the question. We don't think there's a very high likelihood. That being said, I haven't talked to anyone specifically who has expressed an interest in utilizing builder's remedy, but that doesn't mean that if the council chooses not to adopt the housing element, this evening that, we won't receive one in the next 1, 2, 3 months moving forward.
Thank you. I won't hold you liable, Mr. Paulson.
Councilmember Rennie.
Two things. Just to remind us, Builder's Remedy has to be a project that's 20% low income, not just below income, but the category called low income, which I assume is much harder, or it could be a mix of 10%, something in.
So you're right on the 20% low income or 100% moderate income. And that's for the housing units. And then if it were a mixed-use project, I believe, and I'll defer to Director Paulson, but I believe it would have to be 2/3 residential.
Okay, so that it's a pretty high bar. Somebody has to really come. A lot of times we get projects and we require inclusionary housing at 20% usually, but we get these moderate as our affordable houses rather than low. So my point is it's a higher bar than one might think. I did have a question. If we don't adopt tonight, what do we think our schedule is for the next submission? Without slogging through all the detail, it looks to me like the long pole in the work here is the fair housing work, because we have to go to our consultant, and they may have many other cities that are now trying to get them also to help them, and then it comes back to us and so forth. So I could see it might take a while to get some of the consultant. I know I heard you say you were talking with the consultant, and I looked through a lot of this work, and I think some of it we can do ourselves fairly quickly, but I'm most concerned about there's a couple places where we need more work on fair housing. We need our consultant to effectively do that for us and then come back to us. So give me some kind of idea when we might be ready to submit again if we don't adopt tonight.
Thank you for the question. The next steps obviously are to continue to work with the consultants and staff. We've broken out and are working diligently on all items, and we are looking to go to HEB on February 16th to bring the letter as well as summarize how the comments will be addressed. We're hoping by mid-March we'll be able to return to HEB with an edited draft. That's our ultimate goal. And then following that, there would be a 7-day public comment period where the draft needs to be posted online, that show the strike-throughs and changes. That is when we are able to receive public comment. And then there would be an additional 60-day HCD review period.
And if I could just follow up. So, so their 60-day review period, but at that point, we could, which is late March, say, we now think we're in substantial compliance and adopt it while they review it. So our builder's remedy window is really the end of January to the end of March. Am I correct in understanding that?
Possibly, I would have to ask Ms. Armour or Director Paulson if we would need to return to Planning Commission and then Council.
Thank you for the question, Council Member. Yes, if the town was interested, if Council directed staff to bring forward the next version for adoption prior to submitting to HCD, that can be done, but it does need to go to Planning Commission for a recommendation to Council, and then we would have a similar conversation that we're having this evening.
So then if I add to it, it's probably Planning Commission early April, Council second, maybe the third Tuesday in April might be when we would have a chance to adopt it. So our window is February, March, April, basically, that builder's remedy is possible.
That sounds about right.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Hughes.
As a follow-up, is there also a requirement to go to the Housing Element Advisory Board?
Yes, and we plan to do that on the 16th, and again, mid-March, we would have a draft, hopefully have a draft returning to HEB.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I mean, I think, what I'm hearing is the initial concern, and, first of all, I want to apologize to staff because we did ask you to jump through a bunch of hoops on an accelerated schedule to get this first draft version to the Planning Commission and now to the council. And now it sounds to me like, as we're weighing the risk of the builder's remedy versus some other litigation by people, I'm hearing people leaning toward feeling like maybe we don't want to jump through this hoop right now. These are things I'm hearing. I'm frankly curious. I mean, I'm not hearing anyone from the community worried about the builder's remedy, although if a project comes forward, I'm sure we'll hear a lot about it. There's always uncertainty, but I don't know. Thoughts? Councilmember Rennie.
So rather than apologizing, I'll just thank staff because that was, there was one or more council members that did on December 20th say that they were worried about builder's remedy. And so staff has tried to accommodate the will of the council. So I want to appreciate them for going through the whole process and providing us this option. I'm a little bit on the fence, whichever way other council members want to go. If we do want to adopt it, I have a lot of details I want to slog through, but I'm not going to slog through them if the will is to not adopt tonight.
Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Quick question for staff. So I think we know what the builder's remedy might look like. What could this suit look like? Well, what would that do to the town?
So it would be to undo the town council's adoption of the housing element. And so it would put the town back in the position of not having an adopted housing element. And so it would be as if we had never adopted it. So it kind of circles back to the builder's remedy.
Thank you. So I'll just say that doesn't, I don't know, if we're concerned about getting put in this bad situation, that doesn't seem that different to me. I don't know. That's just a thought.
Councilmember Hudes.
Would an additional consideration about adopting and then being sued be that the town would incur potential legal costs associated with a lawsuit?
Yes, there's a private attorney general doctrine where if somebody brings a suit that causes a town to reverse course or take a different action, that party can claim the right to attorney fees as a private attorney general.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just put it out there. I mean, we're not hearing from our community development director that there's a lot of projects at the moment. I think, if all of a sudden we're struck with a couple thousand units in 3 months, that would be unbelievable. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm thinking that maybe I'm not hearing the will to move forward tonight. I don't know if anybody is feeling differently or wants to make a motion in a different direction. Councilmember Hudes.
So I'm very, very uncomfortable about being in the position that we're in. I realize that staff has worked very hard based on the direction that they got from council. But I do want to point out that this timeline is the result of decisions that were made to push forward with the general plan rather than to address the housing element a year ago. And other communities that got onto the track of addressing the housing element are going through the process of getting it certified at this point, not adopting something that will need to be modified. But when I look at the risk profile, it seems that there are two risks. One is been stated clearly that without an adopted housing element by January 31st, the town could risk applications under the builder's remedy. The other risk is adopting a housing element that fails to incorporate changes required by HCD in their January 12th letter And therefore, the town would run the risk of a lawsuit challenging whether the adopted element is in substantial compliance. And I think we've heard a bit about what the consequences are of such a challenge, which would include potential legal costs to the town, as well as being back in the builder's remedy realm. So I am very uncomfortable in the position, but we have to work ourselves out of this position. And so I think it would be better to adopt a housing element by January 31st, and then to take that risk, despite the fact that it might incur costs if there were a legal challenge, but it would defer the possibility of a builder's remedy coming immediately. This is not a good position to be in, and I don't think we're doing the best for the residents of Los Gatos by creating the deadline and initiating this risk dilemma, but that's the position that I think we're in. And so at this point, I think that it would be best to adopt a housing element now and then use all efforts possible to address every single item in the HCD letter to bring it into compliance and live with it during the time that we're in. So that's kind of where I'm thinking now.
Councilmember Moore and then Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. One other question to staff. What are other communities who are in our position doing this evening, tomorrow evening?
There are a lot of cities in this position, and it seems like an even split between communities adopting a housing element or waiting until it's fully complete.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a lot of company. Councilmember Rennie.
Sounds like I'm going to start slogging through some of the details. The first one is maybe a misunderstanding on my part. One of the things I think that was said early is several of the comments in the letter are no longer relevant because we made some changes to the site's inventory. And somewhere I got in my mind that when we went to 30 units per acre, it eliminated this issue. But then I think I heard it's not about 30 units per acre, it's about making our calculations based on the minimum versus the typical. Could you clarify that for me? Which, in terms of, again, it goes back to which, the comments that we don't think are no longer relevant, why?
Thank you for the question. I'll start and staff can follow up if they need to. There was a question about realistic capacity from HCD where they were asking for a lot of justification about each site. So there was discussion with HCD before we received the letter about looking at an alternative of using a minimum density to reduce the need for as much justification for each site. And so that was an option that other communities had looked at, and so we visited that with HCD staff.
And, okay, so it's minimum density, it's not 30. And the reason I'll go ahead and ask the specific question, because I looked through, and I think one of the comments that they had was about giving more reason why the low-income housing would occur. And we now believe that that's not important to explain why it would occur because we're using minimum density. And I used to think it was because we had chosen 30 units. When I look through the list, there's actually only 2 places that I find where it's not 30 units per acre, but we have listed some of the low-income housing, and those are on 16603 Lark Avenue and 14840 Oka Road. They have 3 low and 6 low on the list. And so I just want to check that we don't need a description for why these low incomes will come per HCD's comments.
Again, thank you for the question. I'll start to utilize to be able to use low income, we do have to use the 30 acres, and you're correct that those two sites are at a lower density. And so that would require further explanation, which we understand that we need to provide, of why that site might develop with, have more opportunity there to develop have lower income units. And I will defer to staff if they want to add anything.
Thank you for the question. So looking at these types of sites, since the town does have an inclusionary ordinance, we really looked at those sites for if a project came in of this scale with that many units, how many units using our inclusionary ordinance would that result in? And so that's where those amounts came from.
And so we do have a little bit of work then on these, looks like 6 units. We only need to address the low, not the moderate. I'm seeing a lot of head shaking, yes, for anybody that's at home and may not see the heads. And it's only 9 units. Do we have extra low-income units specified that even if we lost these, it wouldn't matter? Or do we, I mean, I know our final one, we're going to go describe better, but do we really need these is another question.
Thank you for the question. We do have a 15% buffer, so there is room. So our arena is a certain amount, but there is an additional buffer that's been added. So if a project develops under what we have considered in the sites inventory, we're able to adjust those numbers with what we have with our sites inventory and that buffer.
And so our buffer is overall, but our arena requires overall numbers, but also planning for specific low-income categories. Do we have buffer in this category? I'm seeing heads shaking, yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. I have more questions. Does anybody else want to go while I get to them?
I think you're on a roll. Keep going.
All right, so some of this may be redundant to what you already said, but I find in several places in this letter it asks for more analysis of past programs, performance, and existing conditions in order to be better informed for our future programs is the way I'm trying to get just the right distance so we're not ringing here, is the way I read the letter. So when I think through it, what is the timing of our program implementation compared to the certification of the element, or not the element, of the certification of the element, the housing element? In other words, when this is finally certified, that's when we go out and do our programs, and we have some, I'm assuming, tell me where I'm wrong here, I'm assuming we have some descriptions of them, but the details aren't actually figured out and implemented until actually after we have a certified element anyway.
Yes, thank you for the question. So some of these programs are annual that we're already doing and are required to do, and then there's additional programs that we're adding with this housing element. And so one of the comments from HCD, which we talked about with our reviewer mid-review, was just to provide more information. We shared this with HEB as well. They agreed to provide more objective criteria and also define when different programs would be completed or if they were handled on an annual basis.
Okay, and so what I'm trying to get at is substantial compliance, right? If they're asking for more analysis to help us improve our programs, I'm trying to figure out, is that sort of not important because those programs, the analysis, the information you would take from this additional analysis they're asking for is not needed at this time, it's needed in the future when the programs are improved. And I'm not sure you answered my question, so I'm going to go back.
So, yes, we were just adding more information to those programs, but those programs have been identified.
And I think HCD is saying, please provide the more detailed information now in order for HCD to certify the housing element.
Okay. I think I got the answer I was looking for. Ms. Armour, I feel free to add some more.
Thank you. I was just going to add that the letter from HCD isn't necessarily saying that we need to add more programs. It's just that they want us to lay out in greater detail what the timeline and how we will judge that the programs have been effective, some of those kinds of details. So the fact that the programs themselves are not necessarily deemed insufficient, but that they just want some more detail explaining how those will be tracked.
So the example you just gave, I remember, hopefully my memory is correct, so I don't have to try to find it in here. They said, we want more information about your programs from cycle 5, and I think they specifically said to improve your programs for cycle 6. So that means if they're looking for more analysis, they're expecting potentially improvement to the programs for cycle 6.
Potentially, and so giving the justification, the additional information that they're looking for, in most cases, from what we've seen, it appears that it's really just going to be providing that background information and additional specifics as to how these programs would work better than what's been done in the past. And so that is our general sense. I'm also going to pass off to Jocelyn Schutman, who has something to add.
And something that we also heard from our HCD reviewer is the term quantifiable objectives. And so they keep asking for that. And so we got information as to what does that exactly mean. And for example, if there's a program that's talking about supporting or creating affordable housing, HCD is really looking for us to quantify how many units do you expect to be able to produce with this program in the next 8 years. So quantifying it is some of that additional information they're looking for.
And if we gave them more information and they ultimately said, well, it doesn't look like you're going to produce the minimum amount needed, then we might not be in substantial compliance anymore with what we've adopted. So what's the question in that? You see where my reasoning's going. Do I have a concern here?
Thank you for the question. And so we haven't received that type of feedback from HCD as to what happens if the housing element doesn't meet that quantifiable objective. So for example, if it said we're going to try and create 3 of these types of units within the 8-year cycle, is there a penalty perhaps by HCD if we don't achieve that amount? It's not a question or an answer we've received from HCD. What we've heard from them is try and do your best to quantify those and move forward.
Okay. I don't see any other hands, so I'll keep going. I alluded to it earlier, but again, I looked through here. I'll ask it sort of again, or I think I stated it. I'll ask it now. There's a number of places that look like they need consultant help, like the AFFH area. Could you summarize for me from the letter, what are the areas that you need consultant help for? Again, because I'm thinking of that as kind of the long pole in the tent.
So the items that are not local knowledge, we will be providing that information. Staff will be providing that. We started meeting with our AFFH consultant in December, guessing what HCD would potentially put in the letter. And so they did provide great feedback with regards to what that might be. So we've been working on that since December. And so we did meet with our staff, again, our consultants today, and we found that in the next couple weeks, they will have that work completed.
Okay. Thank you. That makes sense. The next item I had, they mentioned under an underline called site inventory, the North 40 being the same min and max, and that seemed to bother them, but why do we have the same min and max? we have a min of 30 and a max of 30, and other places we have min of 30 and max of 40. Why are we constraining the North 40 to a max of 30, causing them to comment?
Thank you for the question, and I'll defer that to Mr. Paulson.
And I'll just add to it, they're saying it's a potential constraint, calling the min and the max the same. So why have we done that, and why would it be a constraint? And they're worried a lot about constraints to the housing actually occurring. And so a bad constraint might mean that we're not substantially compliant. So I'd like to understand this one better.
Thank you for the question. So currently the specific plan for the North 40 has a maximum of 20 dwelling units per acre. And so right now in this version you're looking at, there was an implementation program to modify this specific plan to increase it to a maximum of 30. And so that's why for that particular column you see a minimum and a maximum of both 30. We've had a conversation with HCD that if we change the maximum to instead to be 40 dwelling units per acre, to mirror what much of the boulevard at the mixed-use commercial designation is, then that would take away that comment, and we could utilize the minimum of 30 and revise that existing program to state that the maximum would be modified to 40.
And so the follow-up question is, if we decided to adopt something tonight, could we change that in tonight's version to be a maximum of 40 on the North 40 so that this comment's not relative? If anybody thought this was a potential significant non-compliance item, we could fix it tonight. Is that possible?
That's correct.
Anybody else have questions yet, or shall I keep going?
If I could ask a little
Please go.
follow-on in terms of, you have a lot of great points. In terms of the quantifiable issues where we have to do some measurements, are those, I mean, I know that's to see how we're doing. Is the purpose of that for a course correction during the 8-year cycle, or is it to feed into the next cycle? Like, I'm assuming the reason we have to quantify this and track it is so that there can be adjustments made at some point if something's working or not working.
I can start and then Ms. Shoopman can follow up, but yes, it's in order to see how we're doing, and that we will include a checkpoint where we'll be looking to see how the town's doing in comparison to those with our annual reviews.
Okay, and it's not really relevant to adopting tonight, but just out of curiosity then, if we find out we have something and just nothing, we have a program and it's producing nothing, would we then be required to come up with a different program, or would we, if we have multiple programs that are supposed to incentivize housing and one's not working, we just lean into the others more? Or what are the requirements for us on that?
So thank you for the question. So a lot of these programs under the time frame we do have that we're going to be looking at them annually or checking in on them. So we do have the ability to adjust them if we need to.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Director Paulson.
Thank you for the question. To add on to that, we've seen in other housing elements where they have, like a specific date, like mid-cycle, that, you're checking in on this specific program, is it achieving the goal that was intended? And if not, why not? And then does that program need to be modified? We wouldn't be modifying the housing element, it's just maybe the implementation of that specific program might look different than it originally was intended.
Okay, thank you. I think that gets to, I guess what I was really asking, which you've answered, is once we have a certified housing element, we don't need to be amending it. Staff has the ability to adjust implementation programs to keep it moving. We wouldn't be seeing it again once it's certified. Is that correct? I mean, we'd be seeing the updates, but we wouldn't be amending the housing element again after it's certified?
If we're changing anything that's set in stone in the housing element, the council would see an amendment come to you.
Okay. All right, thank you. Councilmember Rennie.
So if I go to the next spot, slogging through all the comments, they have one with the underline called small sites, which is about half-acre sites. And when I looked through, we don't seem to have any half-acre sites that are on the affordable list. Did we used to have them? I'm trying to understand why this comment is there, because they're talking about it not being suitable to accommodate low-income housing, but our small sites don't have low-income housing assigned to them from what I can tell.
Thank you for the question. The small sites, actually, we have a couple sites like the lodge that has multiple parcels associated with it. And so some of those, and also in North 40, so some of those are considered a small site, but we talked to our HCD reviewer, and we will provide description of how that works as one property rather than individual parcels.
Okay, so in the case of the lodge, for example, it's multiple parcels owned by the same person. The North 40 is multiple parcels owned by the same person or multiple persons?
Multiple persons.
Okay, so that might be a little harder to describe to them, right? Because multiple persons or companies have to agree to combine.
Yes, and Ms. Shootman, if you want to add any other small sites that have been identified.
Thank you for the question. So the majority of the small sites that our HCD reviewer was really keying on is within the North 40 specific plan. So it's really providing that additional context that we have a specific plan that governs these sites. And this is why we feel that these numbers we've provided can be generated in terms of affordable housing. And so it's giving that context.
And also that particular place where there's a problem, we have a minimum density of 30, which they already think is a good way to help affordable housing occur. So that's a positive, even though we have to do a little explanation while I see lots of head nodding yes for those people at home. I'll move on to the next one unless somebody else wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have one quick question. So our current buffer that we put in this new version is 16%. I'm wondering if any of these comments they talk about, some of these things that are things like stock of housing condition, things that is there any possibility that we're going to have to take units out to comply with any of HCD's comments, in which case we might need a higher buffer to make sure we stay, above that 15% buffer?
At this time, we haven't heard that, but they will be reviewing the site's inventory when we resubmit.
And so would we have the opportunity to raise that buffer or put more units in, or is now the opportunity to do that?
I would ask staff to assist with this question.
Thank you for the question, council member. We went through a pretty extensive exercise with the HEB, as you'll recall, and we kind of had these sites in town broken into different tiers based on specific parameters, owner interest, previous applications that maybe have gone through the CDAC, and so we could always increase the buffer. We would just be trying to find sites that either we have different information now, so maybe they weren't they had not filed an owner interest form previously, but now maybe they have, or we have an application that we speak with somebody about. So there are abilities to do that. I think, the other piece is, I think that we'll have to think through on the back end from an implementation standpoint is we're only intending to do modifications to the zoning and general plan for these specific sites. Because of the no net loss regulations, if we start dropping below that buffer in any of the categories, then that's when we'll have to go out and identify other sites and then bring those in and make those modifications at that time. But if the council's interested in a higher buffer, we can take a look at that before we submit another version and see if that's something that we think is feasible. But at this point, we feel pretty comfortable moving forward with this unless there's other direction.
Okay, Councilmember Moore, continue.
Thank you. And just one more follow up on that. So when you say we could increase the, the sites, or we could increase the buffer, are you saying that after we do this tonight and we go, can y'all continue through the process on the staff side? Or are you saying that we could do that tonight as in terms of the council?
Thank you. So I think it'd be a little bit challenging trying to have that type of conversation on the dais without, the buckets of tiers, and then trying to get everyone on the same page as far as what's on that site and making that kind of tweak. But if there were a direction, for instance, to look for, there's an interest on part of the council to have an even higher buffer, then, we would be interested in that feedback this evening.
Okay, no, that was my hope, is that we wouldn't have to figure that out right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I was thinking about the 15% buffer, which now seems like a bigger buffer because we've gone to the minimum density everywhere. So it's possible a site could develop at a higher density, in which case we're not quite up against the edge. But that site's inventory isn't frozen in time. If for the no net loss housing, we have to start looking at the next tiers if things don't develop as expected, correct? Okay, so this is a living document and an ongoing process. Are there any other comments, questions, potential motion? Councilmember Hudes?
I just wanted to express a desire, if we haven't seen it already, to actually have attachment 16, maybe to take a recess to review that at some point, because I would have a hard time reading it and voting immediately.
Okay, is there any? Okay, one more. We'll do questions and then we'll take a break when we have that. Okay, thank you. Councilmember Rennie.
I have more slogging, actually.
Slog along.
And I, by the way, I did look at the attachments, and really it's mostly modifying. I mean, it's long, but it's modifying the site numbers because we went to minimum, and then there's a few word changes. So it might be easier online, but you'll actually scroll through it pretty quickly, I think. So a recess is a good idea. But if we could continue my slogging before we get to that. So there was a comment about SB 9 sites. They want us to talk more about our experience and market conditions that we think would, I think 96 is our number that we have in our plan over an 8-year period. I'm wondering, do we have enough evidence to justify 96 units, or will, after we describe this, there's a risk that they'll say, oh, we don't believe you, it's not 96, it's 76, and we have to go find another 20. I'm making numbers up, obviously.
Thank you for the question. We did discuss this with our HCD reviewer, and they were looking for just a more robust discussion of how we came to that number with the applications that we received in this last year. So staff feels that we could move forward with that, similar how to we're making that estimate with regards to the ADUs.
So you think there's very low risk that they would not accept our number based on further explanation?
Staff didn't get that sense in our meeting.
Okay. If I keep going. So there was a question where they wanted us to better describe things like transitional and supportive housing zoning and permanent supportive housing and employee housing and manufactured housing section. I was curious, do we allow, they seem to be implying that we should allow, I know that was maybe something different. So do we have zones that allow supportive housing, transitional and permanent? And then there's also the manufactured housing question. Do we allow manufactured housing? I assume that they want that allowed because it lowers the cost to be able to bring in a pre-made chunks kind of thing.
So they wanted to describe it from our current zoning, what is allowed with regards to those by right. And so staff would provide that description, and I'd have to defer to staff without looking up on a computer of where those are located right now.
But we do have them now, and it's not a risk that they'd come back and say, well, you don't have any, you need to go create some.
If we don't have, because that is has a couple items on that list. If we don't have those by right, then we could create a program that would allow them in a certain zone. And I believe too, there's some state requirements, state law requirements that require some of those to be allowed by right. So we would just be meeting state law.
Okay, thank you. So there's a comment about land use controls. It must identify and analyze all relevant land use controls, impacts on potential constraints. Are these comments not relevant now if we are using minimum density or calculations? I thought this might be one that's not relevant anymore. It's underlined called land use controls. And it says, for example, the element should analyze all development standards by zoning districts for impacts on housing costs and ability to achieve maximum densities. Well, so we're now assuming minimum densities, so this is maybe not relevant anymore?
I think the change to the sites inventory affected comment number 3. I think it took care of what was in comment number 3. And I don't think it affected comment number 4, but I actually don't know for sure.
Yes.
This is part of comment 4. It looks like I copied and pasted onto a Word file so I could add stuff, and my formatting went a little crazy.
Okay, I think Ms. Shootman had an answer or was going to comment.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll take a start at it. So some of these comments are those that our consultant is still working through, but we can take a stab at it from the initial conversations with HCD. And so they do talk about discuss any local initiatives or referendums. And so we did have that conversation with our reviewer that we would better describe the state of the referendum and what the town has done in the time being. And so that's getting at part of the land use control, as well as better describing what our allowable zoning designations are. So going through what are the allowable heights, the densities, the coverage, to show them how we could achieve these minimum densities and giving that additional background.
And what's the risk that when we go through those, they don't believe that we can achieve those minimum densities? I know that's a subjective question, but that's, I think, ultimately what we're trying to just understand before we decide if something's substantially compliant.
No, that's a good question, and I'll take a start at it. It's basically, this is the beginning information that our reviewer was looking for, and so we've had the opportunity to have a lot of follow-up conversations with him, and so we would give this information and follow up and see if there was anything additional that they needed. But our hope is that by providing this basic information of what the zoning designations in terms of their development would allow, that would achieve what this comment is getting at.
Okay. And there was a question about group homes. Do we allow group homes in all residential uses?
Thank you for the question. So there's different categories, and I can't remember the specific category they're calling out, but we have, for instance, in our zoning code, small family home and large family home, and those are determined by state law, which I think now is, 6 is the cap for 6 or 8 is the cap for low, and I think up to 14 or 16 for high occupancy for those types of homes, or large group home. So we'll have to take a look, make sure that we do comply with that state law, and then if we don't, we need to take a look, and that would be another, again, implementation program to modify our zoning code to become compliant with state law.
Okay. And another one they mention is density bonus, that we would need a program to update our density bonus to be compliant with state law. I believe during our priority setting, we put that fairly high on our workload list for our town attorney to do that. So it's almost like we don't even need a program. We'll probably have it done pretty soon. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is.
Thank you. And a lot of these other comments seem to be about creating timelines for when we're going to do things, which I assume is not that significant of work. Staff can do that fairly quickly. I guess we just didn't know they wanted so many timelines on everything.
Yes, thanks for the question. Yes, they're asking for a lot more than they have in previous housing elements. And so each jurisdiction's receiving quite similar comments. And so we've already started that work with regards to laying out timelines.
Okay, thank you. I got a bunch of formatting problem here.
Mayor.
Go ahead. Give me a.
Okay, we'll switch over to Councilmember Moore for the moment.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick follow-up on the density bonus question. Is that the same answer with the ADU ordinance? Is the ADU ordinance going to kind of do the same things that is being talked about in the HCD letter?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, are you working on your formatting, Councilmember Rennie?
Yeah, I'm going to maybe skip that and come back to it. So they have a comment about our Program D additional housing capacity, and it talks about it. I think it says we have a shortfall of adequate sites, or we've stated we have a shortfall of adequate sites, and they're asking for revisions. That's a little confusing to me. When they say shortfall of adequate sites, they mean bare land sites that are nice, easy sites? What does this mean? Basically, their wording says, currently the element identifies a shortfall of adequate sites to accommodate the RHNA within the planning period. And that's underlined. It's an underline that says Program D additional housing capacity. And it's under housing programs number 2.
Thank you for the question. So we'll have to work with our HCD reviewer because Program D is actually talking about amending the North 40 specific plan to increase the maximum allowable density. So that doesn't correlate to what he has provided in his comment letter. So that may require us to go back and perhaps see the program he was actually referring to.
And it might not be relevant since we've changed the density out there, and if we even do a maximum density of 40, it might make him even happier and make this even more irrelevant a comment. Okay. So in number 4, it talks about constraints. It says, as noted in finding B4, the element requires complete analysis of potential government constraints. Depending on the results of the analysis, the town may need to revise or add programs and address and remove or mitigate any identified constraints. So that's some of the work we need to do, I assume, is a little more explanation of constraints, and they mean constraints that make it harder for housing to occur. I'm trying to understand how significant this is, whether it's just a little bit of explanation, or whether they're going to find some real difficulties that are going to take a lot of work to build a program.
At this point, it's providing more local knowledge to HCD with regards to our current, what they may see as constraints, but that maybe the town doesn't experience as a constraint. We talked to them about how our inclusionary zoning ordinance is not a constraint, that we can provide examples of how that's utilized.
So it's not significant work, we don't think, or risk.
We definitely have a discussion of constraints in the draft housing element. It does need more detail, like it needs a discussion of building code requirements, a description of the town's fees and exactions, and our processing and permit procedures.
Okay. So yeah, we know we have lots of additional description to do. What I'm trying to find is whether that results in big absences of programs or shortage of sites. And so far I haven't found that there's any risk of that occurring.
If staff could answer that. Most of these are in the housing element, and so we're just, again, bolstering more information for HCD to further describe what we're already doing or what are existing. We have a whole fee section in there, so some of it also is just pointing out for them to where to look in the document, and so we can also, that's a quick answer to them.
Okay, so some of it may almost be in the document. I'm sure they've got a lot of reading to do from a lot of cities. And some of their comments are a little redundant, because I know I came to another spot in item number 5 they have in here where they're talking about AFFH analysis, and it might result in us having to change our goals or actions or something like that. And I think we've already said we have a fair amount of analysis work, or at least it's work we need our consultant to do. Again, the question is, and I think we may have covered this, do we think there's going to be any significant change in goals or actions as a result of the additional AFFH analysis?
Thank you for the question. So a lot of what has to do with the AFFH is the data that they're looking for, and they reference the acronym RCAA. That data was not available to the town when we submitted to the state, and it's now been made available to us. And so it's pulling a lot of that data and then using our consultant to prepare a narrative to describe it.
Okay, and again, we think it's just going to be mostly in a narrative. We don't expect we don't expect any new programs or much changes to any of existing programs.
There will be a couple additional programs, as we discussed. It's an existing program, but we would be adding more language into it with regard to updating the density bonus, as well as the ADU, just to keep up with state law. So folding that into our updating of our town code.
Okay, next one that's interesting, it says D, quantitative objectives, and they actually have a sentence that says the element does not address this requirement. So that sounds potentially not very compliant. Is this significant now that we have changed to mostly 30 units per acre minimum and are using minimum density calculations? Is this one of those ones that's not as important or maybe not relevant?
Thank you for the question. So this was something we spoke about earlier, which was a new thing that HCD is looking for that they previously did not in the last 5th cycle housing element, which is quantifying the estimated number of units we think that this program could produce. And so it's something that we heard from our HD reviewer, and we're working on including in those implementation programs, creating a new column that's going to be a quantified objective. So if it's a specific program that we're going to quantify the estimated number of housing units we're hoping to achieve in this new cycle.
And somewhere I got the impression that by using our calculations based on minimums, this becomes a less, it sounds like it's some nice additional analysis for them, but it becomes less significant because our housing sites and unit calculation is based on a minimum.
Even utilizing a minimum, HCD is still looking for us to quantify these programs regardless.
Okay, thank you. I think I've kind of come to the end of my list and I'm worn out.
Well, I, for one, appreciate you going through all these comments and looking to see how significant the work is to move forward, or how much we're pretty much already there and it's just some changes. Are there any other comments from council members? Questions? Are we going to need a recess to look at that resolution?
I would certainly request that.
Okay. If we have nothing else to go forward, oh, yes, so our clerk, Ms. Wood.
I just wanted to make a clarification for council and the public in attendance. There was some timing issues in printing with the desk item, but they have been presented for the public and are available. And I just wanted to note that although the size of the desk item is very large, a majority of the portion is due to Exhibit A and Exhibit 2 of the Exhibit 1 and 2 of the resolution, which is the draft housing element environmental analysis that was previously provided with the original materials.
Okay, so if members of the public want to take a look during our break, it's out
Correct.
in the hall. Okay, well then, given that, it's 8:42. Do I have a request for any more than 10 minutes, or do you want 15? Is 10 good? Okay,
That's enough.
so we'll come back actually at 8:55, please. Thank you. If everybody, look, there we go. If everybody who wants to return to council chambers, I don't know if anyone's in the hallway, but we're going to resume the meeting. So the break is over and we are resuming the council meeting. Okay, council members. Do we have any, Councilmember Moore is part of a hand up? There we go. Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. I think I just have one final question. So, when Councilmember Rennie was going through all of the different comments, one of the things that kind of stood out was the quantified objectives. And I'm wondering if staff feels that what we have under item 4 in the draft resolution is accurate. In item 4, section C, which says we include a statement of goals, policies, quantified objectives, financial resources, etc. I guess 2 questions. Has staff done any work to this point since we got that letter about the quantified objectives? Are we going to be able to show anything greater than what we had? And if not, does this still feel like a fair statement in the letter, in the resolution?
So it will depend on whether the existing housing element does contain quantified objectives. It sounds like HCD was asking for more quantification. And so it just depends on what's in there at this point in time.
Ms. Walters.
Yes, thank you for the question, and I would ask Ms. Shootman if she had anything to add on that item. I know we've been working on that.
And I'll add that we do currently have timeframes listed for each of the individual programs and some of those details. We do expect that providing additional details will be part of the final response to HCD, but that it wouldn't materially change the programs themselves.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay. Any other question? Councilmember Rennie.
Yeah, I just thought of a new question, actually. So if we adopt tonight, one of the reasons I can see, HCD has the builder's remedy in there because they want us to get our housing element out there so people can use it. So if we adopt tonight, I assume that means our community can start using the housing element. We have some plans to change programs and so forth, but adopting it tonight, we don't have any, we only have the ongoing programs, right? So we have a housing element, but adopting it tonight, the program work is still to come. Even if it was certified tonight, completely done the way they want with all the T's crossed and I's dotted, we would still have to, from tonight, be then working on the programs portion of it.
That's correct. I guess with the exception of what was agendized for like updating the density bonus and those types of efforts. But yes, that is correct. We would begin that work. We would have to begin that work. We have not started it.
And so again, the reason HCD would want us to hurry up and adopt is so that community can start using it and we get on to the next step of developing the programs, which we're doing anyway.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, this finding is making the statement that we do have scheduled programs included in the housing element. Perhaps we don't have all the scheduled programs that HCD has requested, but ideally in the housing element, there is a discussion of some scheduled programs for the preservation, improvement, and development of housing.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That's really what I'm looking for. Why HCD would actually want us to adopt it, even though it's not done, is so that community can start using it. Thank you.
A follow on to that, and I think I know the answer. I just want to make sure. Anything that we change going forward, like whatever we adopt tonight, the next version that we would be adopting, a certified housing element, would be enhanced, but there wouldn't be anything that somebody could use now that we would revoke, correct? Our housing element will be expanded and enriched, but not, we're not going to suddenly decide to change a density lower or something in a later version. Is that correct?
We would be moving forward with what you adopt, and then if council in the future wanted to modify the housing element, they could do so, but that wouldn't be the intent. It would be, we'd be moving forward with what we have, HCD's reviewed it, and we're gonna address their questions.
Okay, thank you. All right, I see lots of people thinking. Anybody feeling motiony? I mean, as a comment, I do also want to thank staff for all the work that you've done up to this point, and especially through this month getting us here, and then the very thorough answers to the very thorough questions from Councilmember Rennie. I think, you know, we're dealing in an area with uncertainty, but I think the certainty is that we know we're going to get to a certified housing element. We may not know exactly how long it'll take or how much work it'll take, but we have a reasonable timeline, and we really know what we want it to look like when we're done. So we have a good document that is going to be better. So I'm feeling very comfortable between the questions, the comments, this revised resolution, that, you know, with the good advice of our staff, that we know that we can have an adopted housing element. So, you feeling? Councilmember Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. With that, then I will move to adopt a resolution to adopt the draft 2023-2031 housing element with the revised sites inventory analysis and revised sites inventory form.
Thank you. We have a motion. Is that a substantially correct and full motion? I'll check with our town manager.
You might want to reference attachment 16.
Including attachment 16.
Which is the revised resolution with all of the details. Thank you. Do we have a second? I'll second it. Don't seeing any hands fly up. Any comments before I call the question? Vice Mayor Badami.
Thank you. I also would like to thank staff for their efforts to get our housing element certified. Within a short time frame, they've had to address several complexities, and I believe we're getting close. No one likes the threat of a builder's remedy, but what is more important to me is following the rule of the law. And to me, the resolution to adopt, it does not address each of the findings that we need to make. So therefore, it does not fulfill all the requirements of Government Code Section 65585, Section F. I'm also a little concerned that I really haven't had the opportunity to really digest the desk item and the draft resolution. So for those reasons, I mean, we're talking about in this draft resolution, the quick moment I had to review it, it says we will provide additional information at a later date. But as of today, January 30th, 2023, to me, it's not substantially compliant. So for that reason, I will be abstaining from the vote.
Okay, Councilmember Hudes.
I think I'm repeating some things I said before, but I think it's at the appropriate time, that I am reluctant to support this motion at this time. However, I see it as, first of all, something that can be done legally based on the advice that we have about substantial compliance. This topic of compliance versus substantial compliance really comes down to a legal opinion and would ultimately find its way resolved in the courts. I believe that the revised attachment 16 enumerates under 4 the 5 ways in which it is substantially compliant. And I don't have further legal knowledge to be able to weigh the difference between compliant and substantial compliance. I do think that it's about impossible to be 100% compliant until certification occurs. And I believe that there's a process for us to get into compliance, 100% compliance, through an iterative process with HCD. May only be one more iteration, or it could be more than that, but I am confident that the town will get into 100% compliance. And so I will be supporting the motion based on the legal advice that we've obtained here in the hearing and in the revised resolution. I will want to repeat the comment that I don't think we should be here. I think that this is avoidable. Yes, there are tight timelines and deadlines. However, I believe that we did the residents of the town a disservice by waiting until the last minute to do this, when in fact we could have begun working on this a year ago if we hadn't been distracted by the general plan. And that I'm hopeful that with the resolution of the housing element and certification of the housing element, we'll be able to create an acceptable general plan for our residents. And so, you know, I can't, you know, let it go without saying that I don't think we're doing the best thing for our residents by being in this position. But I think being in this position, it would be better to adopt tonight and to, with the quickest way possible, make the changes that HCD has indicated that we need to make to come into full compliance.
Okay, so we're in the moment right now, and we're going to make a decision. Councilmember Rennie.
So just a short comment. I'll support the motion. As you may have seen, I walked us through most of the comments, and although there's still a lot of work to do to address HCD comments, it's more descriptions and more information kinds of things. But I couldn't find anything significant to the the important portions of the housing element to say that we shouldn't adopt it tonight. I'm confident that we have adequate sites selected. I'm confident that we have substantial amount of the programs we need, with a little more to be added. So I will support the motion.
Thank you. Seeing no hands raised, I'll call the question. All in favor of approving the housing element?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Those abstaining? Okay, so the motion passes 4-0 with one abstention. Vice Mayor Badami. All right, do we have any comments from staff? Anything further needed? No? Okay, well, then the meeting is adjourned.